James? Hey, there we go. All right, I got to unmute first before we get going. Haha. All right, how's it going? Welcome to our Nitro workshop today on external data columns. Just keep an eye on the attendees list. It looks like we got a few more folks trickling in, and we'll probably get going in the meat of the content in just a little minute here. But I see some repeat names, so thanks for joining again. And if you are new to these workshops, there are a number of ways you can interact. You can use the questions box, which is in our, in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. You'll see questions. There should also be a chat option if you want to use that. That's fine too. And so if there's anything that's not being shown or something that's not clear, feel free to pop in a question or something we didn't cover. Go ahead, pop in there. So we like to be, I like to be interactive. I like to engage with you guys. So if you have any questions that you think would be better served asking, rather than through chat, let me know. Raise your hand, and I can unmute you and have you chime in. But we'll do that towards the end of the content. It looks like we're getting some final folks popping on now, so it's probably just go ahead and get started with the content. So I'm not sharing my screen yet, so you're not missing anything. But I will go ahead and start sharing right now. Might as well get that going. Make sure you see the right screen. You should see NITRO Forms Designer. I'm just going to leave that up for a minute because I want to talk a minute about what external data columns means and what that can do for you. So the whole kind of core concept behind the external data column is that it is a reference out to another database outside of SharePoint. Typically, that's going to be SQL. I think a lot of times it pretty much always is going to be SQL, SQL database, somewhere. So we have to have that wherever that data lives. It should be accessible from wherever your SharePoint environment lives as well. So we have to be able to connect to it from NITRO Forms. And there's nothing special, just as long as it's accessible from your environment to wherever the actual database lives, it's good to go. There are other options if you have a service or a database that is more restricted or not directly accessible through SharePoint. You can use web services. We talked about that in a previous workshop. I'll touch on that towards the end of this workshop today. But what we're focusing on right now is a database that's going to be accessible from your SharePoint environment, and that is going to be a SQL database and has some information out there that you may not necessarily need to bring into SharePoint or don't necessarily want to bring into SharePoint. It just kind of saves having some kind of connection if it's a database that another group is using that doesn't even use SharePoint, whatever the case might be. Maybe the database is maintained elsewhere and you want it to be able to just connect to it, get the data into SharePoint and have it shown on your form. And so there's a couple options for how you show it on the form. There's going to be the option to show a dropdown, and that's where you're going to pull back multiple records from your external database. And then there's also an option to pull back a single record and map data from that single record into your SharePoint form. So we could do a combination thereof, and that's what I'm going to show you today, is that combination of doing both the multiple records, a pullback where you can see multiple records. Once you make a selection, you'll be able to filter kind of like a cascaded lookup. You'll be able to get information about that specific item that comes back. If it's a single record, you can pull it in. So we're kind of do both scenarios. You can do one or the other in your scenario, entirely up to you and what your needs are. But so we'll start out with going through the configuration to get multiple records back. So in this example, we have a list of departments that lives out in an Azure SQL database. We have a list of employees that has a connection, a join with that department through a department ID field. There's a connection between the employee and the department. So what we're going to do is pull back the list of departments. So you can drop down that list and select something from there. You'll get back one or more employees where you can select one of those options. Then once we select that employee, we're going to be able to pull in information about that employee based on what's in that database. So again, all this information is going to be external to SharePoint. It does not have to be there. In some cases, you might want to bring that in. That's fine, but this is for those cases where you don't need to. So we're going to start out by configuring the external data column. And one thing to note when you're getting this configured, If you have multiple records that you want to pull back, like say that in this example, we're going to pull back that list of departments. When you pull that back, you're going to need 2 single line of text columns pre-configured on your list. So there's going to be the department, which is basically going to be the title, name, whatever it is, the value that the person's going to recognize as the department when they pull back that dropdown. And then there's going to be a stored kind of hidden value called department ID, which is going to be the ID of that record in the SQL database. So we're connecting those two. You got the value that comes back as the visible portion that people would recognize, and then you have the ID, which can be used as the unique value of that record in the SharePoint, in the SQL database. And you'll see I have that here already. I've got the department field here, and it's a single line of text field. If I edit this, I'll just show you that real quick. And it'll just pop up, single line of text. That's all we need. It'll display as a dropdown once we get it configured, but it's single line of text to start. And I'll also show you that we have department ID here. And similarly, we have employee and employee ID. We have all four of those single line text columns that kind of help prepare for this setup in this scenario. All right. So now, where you configure this is in the form itself. So you bring up your form in the Forms Designer, which you should mostly all be familiar with. And you're going to have the section called Form Settings. And within Form Settings, you have external data columns. So we'll pop that open. And we're going to start setting up our new configuration. So we do a new configuration here. And so we're going to give it a configuration name, which can be whatever you want it to be, just some unique value. It doesn't, can have a space, doesn't have to have a space. And a lot of times we say don't use spaces. This case, it doesn't matter because we're not referring to it later on. It's just a name that you can recognize as this is the configuration to get that information. Another piece of information you're going to need is the connection string. So how are we connecting to that SQL database? So, typically that's going to be, kind of encrypted to some degree. And you'll notice when we pop this on here, you won't actually see the data. It's going to be encrypted, and that's the way we want it. It's just a test database anyway, so not a big deal if you did see it, but it is encrypted, so just copy and paste it if you have it, or you can type it out if you know the full string of what you need to put in there. And if you need to see it as you're typing it, there is this option to unhide the string. So as you're typing it in, you can unhide it and then keep it hidden later on down the road if there's people who might be interacting with this who don't need to see what that connection string looks like, because that connection string can include usernames and passwords to get into that SQL database. Again, this is NITRO Forms, so it's all in your environment and not accessible to Crow Canyon. All right, select query. So this is where we're going to determine what data are we getting. We point it to the database. We point it to what elements from that database we want to get into. And in this case, well, we're connecting to the database through here, and then we can also test that connection. I'll just do that real quick to make sure it's typed in correctly. You get this message at the top, connected to database successfully. Hit OK, good to go. All right, great. Now, we do have examples of this on one of our articles, and I pulled this from there, but I'll kind of walk through it. And a lot of you are probably familiar with SQL queries anyway. I'm not super familiar with them, so I will explain it a little bit because some of you might not be, but I am going to, you might already be familiar with it. But the bottom line here is that you have a select statement, and you're going to get fields from the SQL database. So there's an ID field in that SQL database, and then there's also a field or column called department name in that SQL database. So we're going to pull back those two pieces of information, and then we're going to get the from is how we tell the system which database are we looking at. So we're going to get these two columns, ID and department name, and we're going to get them from this database object, DBO, of external data table department. So that was set up specifically for this demo today. Right, so it's going to be whatever you want it to be. You got the DBO, you got to have the dot in the middle, and then around square brackets. So that's how you refer to the table, and that's how you refer to it as a database object. So again, if you're familiar with SQL select queries, I apologize. I just wanted to go into that in a little more detail for those who might not be. This query parameters we're going to get into in a little bit. Right now we're not using them in this one, but we will use them in the next setup, and I'll walk through how what that looks like and how that interacts with our system. All right, and then your database column. So again, this is the name that is from the SQL database. because we're mapping that to a SharePoint column. So we can come up here and copy and paste it just to make sure that it's what we want it to be, or we could directly type it since it's a pretty simple one. But I'll just copy and paste it. Control V down here. Get rid of that end bracket. We don't need that. So it's just the value without the brackets around it. And then we're going to point it to the SharePoint column where we want that data to show up. So that's going to be department, right? So that's going to be the drop down. You see it back here on the form. That's what we want people to interact with to get the data. And then the ID piece, we need to store that ID in the SharePoint list as well. And we got department ID, that single line of text field I already created for that. So one thing you'll notice, and we actually just added this, and I just found out today we just added this, is this ability to select multiple values. So previously, even yesterday when I was setting this up, it was allowing a single value only, which is fine. In a lot of cases, that's probably all you really need. But now you also have the option to pull back multiple values. So you could select, instead of just one department for this form or one item from that the drop down that comes up, you can select multiple items from that drop down. So that is now possible. So if you don't see that yet, go update Nitro. For on-prem customers, it's probably going to come out in the next package, which should come out in a couple weeks for the on-prem Nitro Secure. But if you have Office 365, you should be able to go update Nitro and have that there today. You'll also notice we can enable a search. So if you have a large list of items, say thousands of items, even hundreds of items, or maybe even tens of items, you want to enable a search. So we're going to have that option. So that's going to operate very similarly to what you have with the lookup column search. You type in a value, it pulls back all the records that have that content, and then select what you want to select from there. So I'm not going to use that because we only have a few departments and it's not a big deal. So I'm just going to turn that off for now, leave that off. We're only going to select one department in this scenario. And so that's how it is. That's it. It's configured. Hit OK. Hit OK. We can save that. We could go and publish that too, but I'm just going to do everything through the preview mode because that shows pretty nicely. Actually, one thing before I get that, you'll notice that this department field now has a drop down on it. And that's kind of how you know it's going to be a drop down instead of just a single line text. Pull up in my preview. And I'm going to do this on the new form. And there we go. Okay, took a second to load in, but there they are, the list of departments that we have in that table. So these are the department names. So this is all the values in that department name column on that department name or department database in SQL. So that's what we're pulling back. And then we can identify, excuse me, a particular department. Apologies on that. Okay, so then now we're going to take that a step further. And that might be enough for now. And that might be all you need. Just select one value from that list, a drop down, put it on your form, you're good to go. And that may be all you need. But let's take that a step further. Now you have a second database, a second table, I should say, in your database that has the employee information and that's tied to department in a join. There's maybe a lookup, however it's done through SQL. There's a lookup to that department table there as well. And then you get the list of employees based on the department that's selected up here. And I'll show you how to set that up. Let's go back to our external data columns, and we're going to do a new configuration. Get employees. All right, so again, multiple records. We've got to put in that connection string again. So let me pop over to my string over here. It should work. It's always good practice to test that connection, make sure something wasn't fat fingered if you're typing it in, or maybe there's an extra space at the end or the beginning. Just test that connection to make sure you're good to go. All right, we're good. Now we've got a query. Again, this is something I pre-configured. I'm going to pull it, just copy and paste it and bring it over from a notepad on my other screen. And again, doing a select where we're getting the ID and the name. Again, these are the columns from SQL. We're getting it from this database now, the table of employees rather than departments. And then we have this where statement, where clause, where we're now going to limit what's shown. So this is how we do our cascading. And you notice you have this add department placeholder here. So we can map information from the SharePoint form. It doesn't have to be from the database. In this case, it is, but it doesn't have to be from the SQL database. We can map other information, other fields from the SharePoint form to that placeholder. So if you even directly type in department ID and say, okay, we know my department ID is 1234, and you directly type that into a single line of text field on your SharePoint form, that's going to still work, right? It's going to be fine. In this case, we have it stored in department ID like we did in the previous configuration. We just stored that department ID from the department ID table in that department ID field. And so to map that placeholder, we have to directly type in the placeholder here. Make sure you get it right. Might do copy and paste if it makes some more sense. The placeholder can be, parameter essentially can be text, number, date, and time. We're going to do number, and then we're going to use that department ID field. Now this is coming from the SharePoint list over here. So we got the SharePoint list, item, or whatever value is in that department ID field, we're going to map to that department placeholder. And kind of like working backwards here, now that department placeholder is going to be whatever that department ID is on that particular SharePoint NITRO form. All right. Since we're pulling back multiple records, we have to do this down here where we map the name. Again, that's the field we're getting up here from the database, and we're mapping it to employee. And that's the field on the SharePoint form, the NITRO form. And then ID is the field, the unique identifier. Again, we map that over. All right, I'll hit OK on that. So then hit OK. Let's save that. And then hit my preview. All right, we'll do our new form. And now you see that it looks it's not a single line of text field anymore, it's a dropdown, and you have no values in there. Well, until you go and select a department. And it took a second, but there it is. You have these two values, Vivek and Pavan, are two values from our employee list, which are tied to that IT department through the department ID. And it should, yeah, there we go. Just took a second to kind of reconfigure. And some of them don't have employees. We didn't fully set up the full list. So, if we get down to like sales, I think it's blank, but yeah, there it goes. It goes blank. But you get the idea. You got the department, which cascades the values for the employee, which now you can select IT as department, for instance. You can select Vivek as your employee, for instance, and there you go. All right, great. Good so far? I think everyone's doing good. I think we have some questions. I'll get to those in a little bit. Let's pop those open real quick. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get to some of these questions towards the end. But yeah, so if you have any others, feel free to pop them in. But we'll get to those two questions before the end of the workshop. Okay. So then let's take it a step further. Now we've got our department from our department table in SQL. We've got one particular employee from that subset of employees based on the department that was selected. Now we want to pull in some information. So again, you can kind of see how we're going towards a destination here where you have not just your internal users through requester, but now you can also pull in external users if they're in a SQL database and get information for them in your form. And so similar to that user information filler where you're basing it on the user profile in SharePoint, we can get their phone, department, etc. If that information is in your SQL database, you can do that here as well. So let's go ahead and configure that. So we're going to leave our two configurations here. We're going to add one more configuration. And this time it's going to be a single record. And we're going to get employee info. Okay, so we're going to be based on a single record, and that's going to be that single employee that we pull back from SharePoint. So we can do this on the department field as well if we had information about that department that we want to pull in there, maybe like a department manager, a department approver, or something like that. If you have that information in SQL, you can pull that in. So a lot of different use cases here for this. All right, so I can get my connection string, pop that in there, test my connection, bada bing, good to go. And then we're going to, so this one's gonna be a little different because we're getting this information from the database. Again, I'm gonna copy and paste my select query. We're getting this information from the database, but instead of mapping it anywhere, to, you know, like a query. We're going to map, or you know, you're not mapping it to like two different fields, right? Two single line text fields. Now we can map it to any field. And in this way, you can pull back as much data as you want from that single record in SQL. In this case, we're pulling back 4 pieces of information. Those 4 pieces being name, phone, email, address. As long as that is a field, a column, a header on your SQL database, you can pull it back into SharePoint and map it to a SharePoint column. Now with a single record, you're going to need as many columns pre-configured in SharePoint as you need from SQL, right? So let's say we have 4 columns. We want to bring in, you know, we want to bring in 4 pieces of information, and we're going to have 4 corresponding columns in SharePoint to map that information to, essentially. Get those configured. Even if you have just one, that's fine. You can start with that one and then come back and add the others as you go through and set it up. So in this case, we do have another where clause with a where parameter, which, you know, the at placeholder allows you to make it dynamic, which is pretty nice. We're going to do ID. It's going to be number. In this case, we're going to key off of the employee ID, right? Because that's we want the one employee ID, not the multiple that would come from the department. So mapping employee ID, which was pulled in from our previous configuration, into that employee ID field in SharePoint, mapping it to that parameter. And we're saying where the ID of that record in this database is equal to that on the SharePoint form, pull back this information. And then now we can take that information that we pulled back here, the name, phone, email, etc., and map it to fields on our form. So go email like that. And we're just directly using the same value that was there in the SQL database and mapping it in. So phone, and let's just double check. We have an article on this which kind of goes through the same setup. Let me just double check, make sure I'm using the right parameters here. I believe I am, but hang on just one sec. Oh no, okay, so we do need the full what's from the database. All right, my apologies. All right, glad I double checked. So now it's going to be email. Again, it's sort of similar to what we're doing with a lot of our SharePoint references, is you got the internal name and display name. And in this particular database, the internal name and display name are the same, so it works pretty easily. Do something like that. Then we could even, you know, we can map other things in. Let's do department. Well, we already have department, requester department. Let's do that. And we could take, oops, hit the wrong thing there. Department, boom, there you go. Okay. All right, so now we'll hit OK on that. All right, okay. Save that. You don't necessarily need to save it. I've just been saving all along here just so I don't lose those configurations, but you can set all those up and then hit save. You can set all those up and then hit publish. I just, as a point of caution, I've been hitting save as we go along here, just sort of a, you know, one of those things that you know, kind of practices I have that, I don't know if it's best practice or whatever, but it's just something that, you know, that way you don't lose things as you go along in case your computer randomly shuts down or whatever. But so hit OK. So we're going to go back through, we're going to select our department, select our employee, and now it took a second, but we got the information. Department, yeah, probably, oh, department, you know why? Because it's department name. I used the wrong placeholder. That's why it's coming up as undefined. So that's easy enough to fix that. Come back in here. And we'll do department name and department name. Because that's the value, that's what it means in SQL. So again, we're pulling from that SQL database, not from the SharePoint list into the SharePoint column. So this one over here is the SQL information. All right, save that, hit preview. And hit OK. And now it should come up with the correct information. Oh, still undefined. All right, well, that's all right. I'll have to look into that. Maybe not quite set up correctly, but that's just kind of work through that and iteratively figure out, okay, what are we trying to get, and what's the actual name of that column? And in this case, it might be that the internal name over in SQL is a little different. I'm not aware of that, and I'd have to go into my SQL database and find that out. Not a big deal. Once I get that information, I can configure it correctly and be off to the races with getting the information in here. So again, we've kind of walked through a couple scenarios here where we're getting information from a SQL database and mapping it to our SharePoint column. We're getting information from another SQL database, which could be based on information from that other SQL database. And then we're getting information about that particular record in the SQL database, right? So now we're getting information about that Vivek Agarwal record row. We're pulling in that data, and as much or as little data as you need to pull in, you can do that. And that's how the external database column works. So it gives you a way to reference information that doesn't necessarily have to be in SharePoint or is managed outside of SharePoint. For whatever the use case is, you don't have to have that data there, right? So it doesn't have to be brought in. Now, if you are using other types of scenarios of syncing things in and or using web services, we do have all those options available. They're just not here in the NITRO Form tool, but they are there in the NITRO Workflows tool. As I mentioned, we had a previous workshop where we talked about that REST API service, where you can go and get data from another database, bring it into a SharePoint. Well, actually reference it and then bring information back from that database. Kind of the same thing, the similar thing we're doing here, but where you don't necessarily have that direct connection between the two, right? So maybe some cases you don't have a direct connection between your SharePoint environment and where the SQL database is. In that case, you need that kind of intermediary, the API, which is the web service, to get that information. And so we do have those tools available in here as well with the NITRO workflows and also with custom actions. As a matter of fact, we have it there too. So you can utilize those resources to get the information into SharePoint. But yeah, if you have a direct connection to your SQL database, this is a really simple way to do it without having to go through the web API machinations and figuring all that stuff out. Similar, but just kind of different levels. And then ultimately, if you wanted to bring that data into SharePoint and use it as you would any other SharePoint list, you have the option to use our, take a look at our data sync service, which is an additional service where you can create a connection with a database and bring your information into SharePoint, use it as you would any other list. And that way, then you don't have to worry about all this. You can just do normal lookups or NITRO lookups and whatever the case may be. But that's just another level of how you can interact with data outside of SharePoint. So a couple of different options there, a couple different ways you can do that. So let's take a look here at some questions that popped up. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to pop them in there. But the question was, excuse me. Question was, what is needed to connect from online SharePoint to on-prem SQL? Well, that's a good question. From your online SharePoint, so basically your on-prem SQL would have to be accessible from the internet, because SharePoint Online is going to be out there on some server that Microsoft is provisioning, South Central, like in Houston, I think it is, or West Coast, probably somewhere in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, wherever it might be. You have your Microsoft hosted service over there, and that's accessible from the internet from the browser perspective. And so in a similar way, all your interactions happening from the browser perspective, your on-prem SQL would have to be accessible from the internet in order for that to work. So if you don't have that accessible, if your on-prem SQL is not accessible from the internet, that's going to be a little tricky to do with SharePoint Online. There's going to have to be a go-between or maybe some kind of Windows service that would, a Windows go-between service which would connect to your SQL database online or on-prem, and then also communicate up to Office 365. And I know we do that at some level with our Excel to SharePoint tool, kind of similar concept where you have an Excel spreadsheet locally on your local drive, which is, you can kind of think about as your database. That has to connect to both that Excel sheet, and it has to connect up to the source, or I'm sorry, the destination database, which is your SharePoint list of wherever it might be. So it does have to be probably some kind of Windows service that would connect to the two. Otherwise, if your SQL database is accessible from the internet, you would just use the same, kind of connection string that you would from anywhere else to get to it, and that should work. It should just work. But yeah, otherwise you'd have to build that kind of connection out through a custom web service. All right. Then we also had a question about let's see, about Washington D.C. Oh, okay. Question about some sessions to attend. There's a Washington D.C. conference that's coming up. EduCon 365. That's kind of the new, the reimagination of SharePoint Fest, SP Fest. That's going to be coming up in DC. I think it's the 13th, 14th, no, the 14th, 15th, 16th, I think it is. I think there's some workshops maybe on the 13th, 12th and 13th before that, but we'll be there. Kirk Canyon will have a booth, and we'll be able to, if you happen to be going to that SharePoint conference in DC, stop by, say hello. We'll be there. I won't personally, but representatives from Kirk Canyon will be there to say hi, and you can ask them any questions that you might have. But yeah, that'd be great to see people in person. That's part of the reason I showed my video today, is because I'm kind of sick of just being a faceless voice behind the screen. I wanted to kind of show you, warts and all, what what it looks like, kind of, then use my video a lot more internally too, which is kind of nice to actually start seeing people again. Anyway, I hope everyone was okay with that. Any other questions? See, we pop them in there.
That's good,
we also
James.
have Scott online. Yeah, go ahead.
What's upcoming for workshops? What do you have going on for next?
Oh yeah. Thanks for the reminder. So we don't have it listed yet,
but it's there,
no,
right?
we didn't list it yet. But you guys will be the first to know that we have a end of year roundup. Essentially, on December 15th, we're going to do an end of year roundup where we're going to talk about all the new features we released over the course of the year. We had one kind of halfway through the year back in June. I'm not going to recap everything there, but we'll take kind of the highlights from the first half of the year and some of the highlights from the second half of the year, and just kind of give you a sense of what we've been working on. And I won't be able to help myself, but I will talk about what we're going to be upcoming in the future as well, kind of roadmap in a sense of where we're going with Nitro. But just a recap of things. And we are going to be talking about in January, again, not posted here yet, but we're going to be talking about in January the workflow designer. So you guys are aware we have the custom actions designer, which gives you a kind of visual interface of developing or designing custom actions. I think a lot of you have seen that, but just kind of revisit this real quickly. We have this whole like designer interface that we've got here now for custom actions. We're still a few weeks out, which is why we're pushing the workshop out to January for this. But we're going to have the same kind of interface, the same thing you're seeing on my screen here for workflows. So it's not going to be just for custom actions anymore. It'll be there for workflows. A lot of the same UI that you're seeing here is going to be the same as the workflows, but it just gives you another way to interact with our workflows and develop our workflows that make it look nice and kind of the more BPMN model. And keep an eye on this. We're going to be augmenting this. This is one of the big initiatives we have for 2022, is to add a lot more to this. So what you see now is sort of like, it's good. I mean, obviously it's great visualization of what your workflow and custom action is doing, but it's going to be so much more. And by this time next year, it'll just be, it'll be a lot different and be a lot more to it. So there's a lot coming down the line, a lot more in the future. Yeah, I think with that.
Well, wait a minute, James. Also, we're going to be working on there's going to be a workshop on using the knowledge base, know how to know, using the knowledge base at the end of January, because we're working on improvements with the knowledge base, and that's tied very closely in with our idea of the using the MS Teams and bots to accelerate IT support. We're going to do a end of January. We're going to have a webinar on using Microsoft Teams and bots to accelerate IT support. We're finding a lot of good use out of the bot, the NITRO bot, and making some improvements to it and tying it into knowledge bases and giving users a way to use Teams to interact with the help desk or any of our applications, really, purchasing or work orders or assets. But we're focused on IT support at first because that's a great way. So the end of January, we'll have 2 sessions. One will be a webinar on the bots in Teams. I do a lot of those already, but this will be focused specifically on IT support. And James will give a workshop on the knowledge base, which can be used by itself, but also can be tied into the bot as a way to provide answers, or the portal for that matter, right, James? It's
Yeah,
knowledge.
exactly. Yeah.
The bot isn't dependent on the knowledge base. The knowledge base is not dependent on the bot, but they can work together quite nicely. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
So that's a couple of things coming up in January. We're already looking at 2022 here, and we're looking beyond the
Yeah, I know.
holidays, right?
I know. Well, that's the way you gotta be.
Soon enough, right?
Yeah. It comes up quick.
There is
That's right.
another
Yeah.
webinar on the 9th, right? Is that listed on our website yet?
For some reason it just hasn't gone there yet, but we do have a
What?
webinar coming up on the 9th as well. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's on. We're going to show our asset management program and equipment tracking, and 3 case studies where we've been successful with it. I mean, 3 very, very good implementations of it, 3 variations of it. One is with a dispersed workforce that has offices all around the Western US and Hawaii and Alaska, and they're using it to manage IT help desk and asset manage assets. Then there's another one is a nuclear power plant. I don't know how popular nuclear power is. It kind of varies, but they are using our asset management, equipment tracking for critical essential assets at a nuclear power plant in Canada up on Lake Huron, Bruce Power. So we will be showcasing some of what we're doing that, and that applies to a lot of any kind of utility generation or irrigation or a lot of government. And same idea, just show you the range. One is the dispersed offices, one is this nuclear power plant with critical essential assets, and then the other thing is the retirement homes in Australia. We have a project going on where we are meeting legislative requirements with this asset management plan that the facilities, these villages of retirement homes, have to track according to the new legislation that came out. They have to track all their assets. In this case, really, they mean equipment, dishwashers, refrigerators, lawn chairs, shuffleboards, I guess, for retirement homes. Who knows what they have? Their ping pong tables. I don't. They have to track all that stuff and get reports for 3-year and 10-year capital expenditure. In fact, can you show the assetjourney.com website? This is a Crow Canyon sub brand. Yeah, the sub brand. We can show them a demo of it, but we're doing this for retirement homes in Australia. This is a Crow Canyon we're joint with a group in Australia and Sydney doing this. In fact, they're having a trade show today in their time today on this in Sydney. We're not there, of course, but James and I would love to go to see all the rare, unusual birds and wildlife down in Australia, but maybe someday.
Yeah.
But now it's being run by our people in Sydney, and they are showing this to retirement home operators. And this will apply throughout the whole Australia at some point. Right now, it's just New South Wales, which is the most populated and where Sydney is. But they're looking to pass that legislation in the other states, possibly New Zealand. And of course, this has applicability to anybody who's managing facilities of some sort inside of the US or Canada or anywhere else. So this is a kind of exciting thing that we're, side project we're working on, you could say. So it's just another example of how flexible and capable all our applications are. When you get our NITRO Studio going, you're able to take the asset management or equipment tracking and adapt it for all kinds of needs and purposes. And like James was talking about, external data connections come quite critical in something like this, right? This AMP program, we have people talking about bringing in maintenance tasks or, asset databases and equipment databases and, all kinds of ERP systems integrating with this AMP, right?
Yeah.
Right, James?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly where we tie in very nicely with that stuff with the REST APIs, workflows, or data sync service, however it needs to be done. There's options for making it happen. Myriad ways of doing those integrations. So I think there's a lot of options there for that, and that's where we're pushing our asset management program in a lot of ways, is to have those connections and integrations and have the better interface. So yeah, it's a cool little side project. I agree. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, we do a lot with these kind of integrations with other systems. That's more. And also the other thing is this program has they have a lot of mobile interests because of,
Mm-hmm.
being facilities management. They're roaming around a lot with their mobile phones. So we have our bot running on the mobile app inside of Teams, and it will
Mm-hmm.
give them a very capable mobile activity. I gotta take this call,
Yeah,
but you can go on,
sure.
James, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, the mobile story is, it's pretty good, but there is a big push by Microsoft to go into the team space and the Teams atmosphere a little more. That's where the bot comes into play. I know some of the good folks on this call have actually used the bot, and that's another area of focus we're going to have in 2022 is any improvements we have on it. Although it's very functional today to, great way to interact with the system and pull back data from your SharePoint list and SharePoint forms into the Teams interface. So the bot is a great interface and resource for that, with all the different options and commands and tie into the workflows and whatnot. So there's a lot of great a lot of great use cases there for the bot. And that really it does help with the mobile story, because I even find with the standard kind of SharePoint, modern UI and the mobile interface, sometimes it switches over to the SharePoint, the SharePoint app on my phone, and it's just like, meh. I don't know. Microsoft's trying, I guess. So I think that's maybe why they're pushing people to Teams more than strictly saying go to the mobile browser or whatnot. But we're right along with them. I think the Teams interface and Teams interaction through the bot is a much cleaner, honestly, much cleaner way to interact with systems, much cleaner way to deal with stuff, and it's just a matter of getting it configured and set up and working right for your scenario. But it's all very capable, and again, like we're just going to keep adding on features and make it more and more powerful.
Yeah, very exciting. We're doing a lot of webinars on that and stuff. So anybody interested can talk to us about what's involved. Show it. Do a
Yeah.
do a show on it. Maybe if you did one on bot commands, a workshop on bot commands. I don't know.
I did talk about bot commands. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah. Some of the different options I have there, invoking
well,
workflows and whatnot.
okay. Well, we'll do more on that going into 2022.
Yeah,
All right, good. All
for
right.
sure. Okay,
Okay.
well, great. I think that's good. Thank you everyone for joining today. Really appreciate your time, and in this busy holiday season. We will be having that one more workshop coming up. If you don't get a chance to attend that, have a great holiday season, and we'll hopefully talk to you, in the new year. If you do join that workshop, great. Can't wait to see you there, and we'll have more to discuss and more to talk about. So appreciate everyone's time today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Okay. Thanks, James. Okay. See ya. Bye.
All right, bye bye.